Yesteryear by Caro Claire Burke. Yesteryear is the story of Natalie. We open with her telling us that she is perfect at being alive. She is a Tradwife influencer documenting her wonderful life as a mother of 5, soon to be 6. She is 6 months pregnant. And her ownership of Yesteryear Farm, or her husband's ownership of Yesteryear Farm. She has amassed a following of over 5 million viewers. Each morning we witness her give thanks, first for her husband, then for the inheritance, capital I, and then for each of her children in successing order. The premise of the story and the phenomenal and whimsical writing illuminates the fallacy and the hypocrisy inside the doctrine, the promise, and the content of right-wing conservative women, espousing the idea that a woman's God-given place is undoubtedly in the home. The exploration of the performance of womanhood and the author's willingness to engage with the panopticon that we all exist and suffer inside of. This book is sharp, it is intense, it is smart. I was haunted by the imagery, often metaphorically graphic. Sickening. She's such a good writer. It's literally sickening. Let's get into it. We quickly learn that Natalie employs not 1, but 2 nannies to assist in the raising, grooming, feeding, and educating of her many children. She also employs a producer to aid in the social media and content creation responsibilities that finance this family's lifestyle. This is a lifestyle that takes place in an authentically restored barn. Actually, the year before Caleb and Natalie moved into it, the Idaho farmhouse that they were interested in purchasing had been renovated just 1 year prior with all the most up-to-date, latest and greatest appliances. But Natalie and her husband spend millions of dollars re-renovating the home to restore it to its authentic perfection. It's actually revealed that they had to go through like 5 architects to get one to agree to this project because all the rest thought it was irresponsible and a waste of time and money. We also learned very quickly that the Heller Mills family employs several ranch hands on top of their nanny and producer to oversee and engage the less savory elements of farm life. These facts are obviously not readily shared with Natalie's viewers. Natalie notes on like page 3 that her husband really likes to milk their dairy cow, Sassafras, and then she makes a bestiality joke. We immediately come to understand Natalie as judgmental, shallow, calculating, emotionally repressed, and very, very angry. All the while, we witness her leverage these very same accusations at almost all the women that she comes in contact with throughout the course of the entirety of the book. Unfortunately, her daughters are not excluded from this contempt. First, to define Tradwife. The words Tradwife literally mean traditional wife, and yet smushed together, they form 2 other culturally relevant meanings that we must discuss. One of the reasons that the word Tradwife exists as a sort of shorthand is to quickly communicate the agenda that that content creator or person is pushing. People that identify as Tradwives tend to indicate that the personal creed they're espousing is in line with tradition, meaning women maintaining control of all domestic and household tasks and men leaving the home to collect resources to provide for the family inside the home. When Tradwife content creators post images and videos depicting this idyllic life, they feature romantic images of laundry swinging on a clothesline hanging in the sun, smiling barefoot babies clothed in linen surrounded by chickens and white ducks. The more radical of the believers push the idea that it's actually divinely decreed, that women are the more nurturing and attentive sex, and thus are actually destined, preordained for this sort of work. And any choice beside this work is outside of what is congruent with nature and is thus deviant in some way. Some go so far as to argue for the abolition of their own rights, insisting that their households should vote and act within society as a family, with the man acting as a sort of representative as head of household for the entire unit, rather than recognizing everyone in the home as a collection of individuals. The doctrine argues that it is a man's world, in some ways acknowledging the patriarchy, recognizing the more treacherous path these career-climbing women will undoubtedly face in a society that recognizes them as second-class citizens. Subjecting oneself to the duties of man, i.e. work, independence, economy, and purpose outside of motherhood is actually an act of self-harm in itself and is a short-sighted approach to life that will ultimately leave one miserable and unfulfilled. They believe that liberal feminists have been radicalized into ruining their own lives. So, These women insist that peace and harmony exist within the home, that relinquishing your adult responsibilities that foster one's own agency and independence is actually the most freeing thing that a woman can do and should do. Everyone knows women aren't designed for math and taxes. Go play with a baby and roll some dough. This isn't me disparaging that choice or even suggesting that life on a farm isn't peaceful. Perhaps it is, though I did spend a portion of my youth in Iowa, and it was my understanding that farm life consisted exclusively of hard labor, no days off, and a lot of poop. But I guess you could also say that's true of motherhood. So anyway, maybe it's changed, maybe not. I don't know. I don't know anything about farm life, so I don't want to participate in it. Like I said, it's your life, do what you want. A lot of the Tradwife influencer criticism comes from a place of concern as it relates to the political rhetoric these women with power and influence are pretty typically espousing. So for women that aren't entirely sold on this whole nature made your body to be a mother and motherhood is your uterus's destiny idea, we're not even offended by the Tradwife creed that you believe that that's our purpose. You're allowed to do that too. Think what you want. Where the problem comes in is when those people begin engaging in political rhetoric and action that leads them, their followers, and the Mano-sphere to the voting booths and results in all of our rights being stripped. We've all lost rights under this administration because of the things that people said on the internet. For starters, we have to acknowledge that America is built on unpaid and exploited labor, originally slavery. This capitalist nation has never functioned without the exploited worker, without the exploitation of women and minorities and any underprivileged person. This country and its laws were built and written by white men who took it upon themselves to define the humanhood of everyone around them and which rights they saw fit to dole out. Rights are what protect your ability to choose anything. Choose where you live, who you live with, how you live, what you wear, what you eat, what you can buy, whether or not you can go places, what you read, if you're allowed to read, etc. Under patriarchy, white men have unearned and unquestioned power and authority in every single room. Traditionally, women have been forced to marry, literally by society, by their fathers, by their brothers, an agenda often aided by mothers. Women of privilege were traded into titles to make economic deals. You don't get to choose your Prince Charming. Your dad does. Hope he has the same taste as you or cares about your taste. Or maybe at the time you were 13, so you didn't even actually have taste in boys. Or maybe you were gay. Sexual violence is something women have been experiencing without persecution or retribution for pretty much all of history. Underclass women were regarded as property all the same, just with even less choices, just less valuable of an object. As time goes on, even as some women earned the illusion of choice, women were still forced into heteronormative marriages and often into child-rearing. This time for economic reasons, women having been barred from the workforce or from owning credit cards, imprisoned in asylums until their death because they weren't interested in the guy that proposed to them. We exist now in an age where women have more choices than they ever have before in this country. And the Tradwife influencer woman exists as the adjacent part to the right-wing Mano-sphere podcaster, insisting that women of his generation are entitled and out of line. The goddamn irony, it's so annoying. So the Tradwife and conservative community spend a lot of time and money insisting that girls and young women should not attain an education, should marry very young, and that it is their divine, God-given duty to pump out the babies of the men they've waited to live with, sleep with, and really get to know until they're legally bound to them. It is a belief in submission. These women are selling the idea that submitting to a man is so much less work than building your own life. Here's a few reasons why that's not entirely based in truth, and why taking those actions, if you're considering them, might be ill-advised. 1. The state and church routinely deny women access to information about and autonomy over their own bodies. So just automatically, you're submitting to a system that does not know what's best for you because they have a history of refusing to fund the research that is necessary to know what's best for you, and have a history of murdering the women that do have that information because they compete economically with what men think is their divine right. So if that's who you want to pick to be in charge of you, there's nothing I can do about that. And what you're really deciding is what happens to, in, and around your body. It's also a system that propagates to its followers that men have inherent power over the weaker sex because they are born to dominate it. There are a lot of people that think that those ideas are not just crazy, but harmful. Another reason why it might not be a super amazing idea to totally shove off all your agency onto anyone with a penis is because men are not traditionally reliable. In fact, they're notoriously unreliable. Not all men. They have well-documented history of violence and aggression toward their most intimate family members. It's ill-advised to depend on anyone you don't know. It's ill-advised to trust an entire gender without any sort of proof because the Bible told you to. Tradwives will insist that it is about trust, and it's about submitting to the trust. And I encourage you to think about who that idea might be benefiting. If you are just going to submit relentlessly and unquestioningly to the abuse that you may be suffering. What's so frustrating about this arrangement is that it also cages the men inside of this provider role. Patriarchy hurts men as well as women. Making a sole adult responsible for an enormous household is stressful and scary and perhaps too much pressure and responsibility. It also prescribes, just as your role is to breed, his role doesn't exist much beyond monetarily and disciplinarily. Is disciplinarily a word? He's the disciplinarian. It shames men for showing affection and experiencing soft feelings and for being gentle, and propagates that strength is in discipline and suffering. The arrangement makes the relationship inherently transactional. 3, just the third reason why it might be something that you should consider before you really dive into the tradwife lifestyle. To submit to tradwifedom is to become a child in your own home, a person with no authority, no control, and no means of escape. Because once you've given up your rights, if you change your mind, which if you're like me, you're prone to do, you've already relinquished your ability to take it back. Just in case something goes wrong. And I'm not saying something's gonna go wrong. I don't know your man. I'm just saying sometimes things do go wrong for people that don't expect them to. Tradwifedom is just an idea propagated to the aching and bruised inner child in all of us. Most of us did not grow up in perfectly functional and safe and warm houses. Most of us grew up with some measure of dysfunction. And the tradwife lifestyle, or the tradwife content, is meant to convince young women and men that linen and raw milk will heal that childhood wound, finally providing you with the safety, stability, and nourishment that you've always craved. It's just a made-up fantasy. You can't relive your childhood. In fact, I'm pretty sure having a baby positions you the farthest away from childhood than you've ever been. It's mom that makes magic of Christmas. Months of planning and budgeting and secret shopping and secret wrapping, and it's Santa that gets all the credit. Christmas magic doesn't just happen. Because I think the truth is, there really isn't an easy button you can press for life. It's going to be challenging and hard, and you're going to suffer regardless. I personally think it's easier with liberation, but there are gonna be a lot of people on the internet that disagree. Okay, so the second important thing for me to tell you about the tradwife name is that it's rooted in inherent fallacy. There is nothing traditional about the tradwife arrangement. In fact, documented history will convince you that powerful white men have always had a vested interest in the suppression of women. Women in these olden days and pioneer days, or whatever age it is you are looking back on, worked as midwives, were single, functioned as village doctors before men swept up and their understanding of evil came through town, pointed at women, called them evil, called them witches for either knowing things that they didn't know, or competing with their industry, or for living on desirable land, or for declining marriage proposals. And then they had them imprisoned, burned, murdered, hurt. That's what's traditional about this arrangement. There's nothing natural about the 1950s housewife. And I think if you really went back there, you probably wouldn't like it. I think it's very weird that we're nostalgic for this time. Not just because the civil rights movement hadn't happened yet, but because the 50s housewife is in fact The Tradwife advertisement. Much like the Tradwife advertisement, the 50s housewife isn't real. She's designed to pull women from the workforce and convince you that this is who you're supposed to be, that it's not just your moral duty to be this way, but it's your God-given appointed role. We also know that women typically feel, or are societally saddled with, more responsibility for and connection with the children they give birth to. Meaning, if you can legislate and control women's bodies, you can also control women. A lot of women in this generation, as some of the more horrific aspects of our government come to light, we have decided not to have children. Not necessarily because they're not drawn to motherhood, but because they don't feel comfortable, feel it's reckless even and irresponsible to subject their yet unborn child to a world that so clearly has no vested interest in their well-being and will insist upon their suffering. Those of us in this generation cannot guarantee, in fact, can't even really hope for, a life for our children that is better than the life we lived ourselves. Right now, our most powerful leaders have been revealed to be pedophiles and sexual offenders, and our society doesn't seem to care. Our climate is devolving due to legislation written and passed by those same individuals. Do you want access to clean water when you're old? We exist inside of a water crisis, a humanitarian crisis, a workforce crisis, and there really doesn't seem to be an end in sight. If you can force women to have children, you can force those same women to sacrifice themselves to protect those children. This is an acknowledged truth inside of Tradwife culture. As a wife, it is your duty and your privilege to sacrifice. You want to know who for? Your husband and your God and any other man who happens to be around. Your husband who makes the rules and controls the money and perhaps knows less than you sometimes because he's also a person. And statistically speaking, if you're a woman, you're more likely to be educated, but that's just beside the point. Being pregnant and giving birth in this country are actually a horror show. In fact, I don't know if you guys watch American Horror Story. I was an avid viewer for like 10 years, but they had this season about pregnancy, and most of the horrific shit was just normal pregnancy stuff. It was just actual pregnancy and like OBGYN stuff. I had to stop. Also, I know, I wouldn't have heard this at 18 either, but you don't want the decisions you make at 18 to be permanent. You just don't. You don't want to be beholden to 18-year-old you. You've got to care about 30, 40, 50, 80-year-old you. And that means caring about the you of today. Because something that science has also provided us is information about our neurology, our psychology, and ultimately our cognitive functioning, the brain. We know that our brains don't fully develop as it relates to understanding consequences until we're in our mid-20s, often as late as 25. So if you decide to get married and have children before the age of 25, it's likely that you don't fully grasp the consequences of those actions. And Burke does a really great job illuminating that sort of reality split for us inside of this phenomenal book. But the reason that we're not thinking about that, the reason that Tradwife influencer cultures don't have to touch that yet, is because conservative culture is also extremely ageist when it comes to women. Conservative culture practices a sort of ageism wherein women over the age of 25 change roles and no longer exist in the sort of ripe relevancy that current Tradwife influencers get to really relish in. Women over 25 are regarded as unripe or wise and warped by the world, educated. You can't look out for your own future when pedophilic culture has made the 30-year-old version of you an irrelevant crone that's terrifying to even think about. Women that vote to strip themselves and other women of their own rights have internalized this misogyny so intensely that when presented with freedom, they fear, diminish, and scorn it. None of this has to be relevant to your choices. That's the point of rights. That's what I, a human being, grant you, a fellow human being. The right to choose to forsake your agency, to forsake your own rights and interests. You're allowed to do that. I don't have a problem with that. I think there's probably reasons that you're choosing to do that, but I don't have a problem with it. No matter how unpleasant, I think that might be for you. It's when Tradwife influencers and Mano-sphere podcasters join forces and insist that all women must live this way, or else they're hurting the children and are perpetuating evil and misery and trying to tear apart the American family because they refuse to participate in it. It's their political advocacy that's doing all the damage, not their 12-second videos of linen. Women have already lost rights under this administration, and when you strip back the rights of anyone, everyone's rights are subject to be lost. Tradwives, these content creators, direct their massive audiences to the voting booths and damn their fellow women as well as themselves. The book never even touches the fact that Natalie, our Tradwife protagonist, did not forsake her last name, opting instead for an unhyphenated 2 names. Because the second fallacy of the Tradwife is that even down to the wire, it's a lie. The whole thing's a lie. It's all a lie. The women running these accounts are in fact the heads of their own businesses, in many cases acting as the provider for the family through this content. Content creation is not just pointing a phone at something and posting it. It's lighting and equipment and angles and scripts and editing and marketing. It's a production, and thus convincing you to willfully silence yourself is in direct contradiction with the noise that they are making online, which they only have the right to do because they now have the right to work. So let's talk about Yesteryear. This book is, dare I say it, brilliant. It manages to be extremely visceral without being particularly graphic. It's a psychological nightmare. If you're not triggered by the birthing dream, anyone who's lucky enough to have attained a secondary education will probably be triggered by Natalie's year at college. So Natalie has been raised in a religious home with her mom and her older sister Abigail. She's been raised by a mom that believes and teaches her daughters that the world is a place to be really weary of, that it's big and scary and mean and fallen into absolute liberal disarray. She was mostly raised without her father, and that her mother, through clever turn of phrase, is posing as a widower in their new community. Tell the teachers your father's no longer with us. Honestly, it doesn't sound like much of a loss. He's not actually dead, but Natalie's mother has asked Natalie to insinuate that he's dead to friends and neighbors because good Christian women don't get divorced and don't remain single, but widowers get a little bit more leniency, a little bit more of a pass. I mean, if their husbands die, what are they to do? Natalie's mom worries for Natalie because Natalie's not particularly likable or friendly. And so Natalie gets into and gets a scholarship to Harvard College, and she decides to go to the East Coast because she hears that everyone there is more focused on intellect and cares less about likability. She wants to move away from Idaho, where friendliness is an essential and the pivot point of each person, and move where her values are more valued. She gets there, though, and is immediately surrounded by the children of the uber rich. She learns that most of them did not earn their way into the prestigious school or onto the elite campus. In fact, many of their spots had been bought through legacy or donation. She rooms with a young woman named Rena, and Natalie describes her as wannabe cool and wannabe smart. Natalie believes that Rena is someone who is not fitting in with the crowd that she had aspired to fit in with. She pities Rena for this reason, but comes to detest her for these other things. The first is, so Rena, in a bid to buy the affection of other girls in their dorm, hosts a pregame before everyone goes out that first night of college. Natalie is understandably uncomfortable, 1, because she's never had any sort of friends, and 2, because she doesn't drink alcohol, and 3, because she's not really able to participate socially. She doesn't have a lot of colloquial understanding the way that these other East Coast wealthy girls do. So she participates in a little bit of the drinking, she doesn't like it, and she goes to bed. That night, Rena comes home much later, and she brings a boy with her. That boy and Rena end up having sex while Natalie's in the room. Those of us who have been to college, maybe you've experienced this, maybe you haven't. And Natalie is horrified. This offends her moral sensibilities, and she hears something, and it's described in detail for us, go on between Rena and this boy, but she also hears Rena consent to continue having sex with this boy. So Natalie would think Rena's a whore just flat out for this behavior, but it's later on campus when Natalie overhears Rena describing that same boy as predatory. Natalie, big shock, despite the fact that she was there, takes the side of the boy, insisting that he wasn't a predator and he did ask for consent and he got it. So she hates for having casual premarital sex and then for changing her mind about whether or not she wanted to do that and reclassifying it in her mind as something that was more assaulting. It sounds like the waters were really murky, and that's another thing that I really respect Burke for, because she's not afraid to have a conversation about consent. We'll get there. So Natalie feels really morally compromised by these women. Natalie hears the conversations in class and in the dorm about feminism and patriarchy and takes these women to be man-hating and family-hating. These women seem to be having semi-didactic conversations about their own mother's agency, the households they grew up in, and what it means to exist without an education or a job or a means of changing one's own life. Natalie disagrees with everything they say wholeheartedly. She thinks of all the happy and kind and wonderful families she knows in Idaho, and she remarks that these girls must feel this way, one, because they're idiots, and two, because their parents don't love them. Natalie really does think that anyone that thinks differently than her is an idiot. It's a word she uses quite liberally, and she thinks about her classmates: you may be liberated, but at least I'm happy. You decide whether or not Natalie's happy. Like, really don't get it twisted. Just because the packaging is a little different, this is the exact same message that the conservative right has been pushing for a long time. It's not new. So the book unabashedly explores themes of performative womanhood, and it does that in a few ways. One, to be a woman is to prove yourself every single day. It is to be believed at baseline that you are incompetent until you prove otherwise. And particularly in a workforce, that's even more exacerbated if that's a male-dominated workforce. It is to show up and be extraordinary just to clear the bar every single day. On the day you don't, the day you're sick, or your alarm doesn't go off, or you have your period, or you snap, there will be people that sigh and say, I knew it. That's what it is to exist inside of an oppressed group, is to make every single one of us a representative for every single one of us. The colloquial baseline assumption for women is incompetence and our lack of threat, and yet we are admittedly the backbone of society. We just don't get any of the credit for it. Again, like all systemically oppressed populations, women are expected to perform a certain womanhood that really is made up by and caters to the male gaze. It's a concept of womanhood that was dreamed up by men that seem to know nothing of women. We engage in that performance to protect men from the disappointing and visceral reality that women are in fact people. We're aggressive, we're angry, we're selfish, and we're gross. We're vastly complicated and multifaceted beings that do in fact process emotion 8 times faster than men. We perform a male-sanctioned womanhood. Softness and warmth, nourishment. We are understood to be careful and kind, compassionate, empathetic, gentle, poised, elegant, alluring. And listen, those things can all be true too. The problem is the lack of socially acceptable diversity in personhood. The insistence that this is the only way, that this shape can exist, or else it's an abomination. And the third way we witness performative womanhood, the Tradwife way, Natalie's way. Natalie's very aware that she's performing. We witness Natalie develop and employ online Natalie in every social interaction. We watch her morph from her unlikable offline Natalie self into the beloved and much viewed version of her. As the viewers of the Tradwives, we never know what they're thinking. That's one of the things that makes the performance not just captivating, but also, I think, one of the reasons it inspires such horror genre literature. We can never know if the person on the other side of the camera believes what they're saying is a victim or a villain. We never know what they're thinking because their lives are the performance. We can never really know how they feel about their arrangement because they aren't free to tell us, because they are inside of a caged universe where they don't make the rules. In other pieces of literature and in real life, these women have been depicted as both victims and villains. Yesteryear portrays a woman so intent on maintaining the illusion of what she has been taught is right and necessary, despite very early on coming to the conclusion that it's all a lie, it's all a performance, and every woman she's ever known has lied to her about everything. Despite the fact that she come to understand it as complete bullshit, she goes to such lengths to maintain that illusion that her psyche actually fractures. She gets really sick. Burke depicts a woman who is both victim and villain, both perpetuator of her reality and someone being subjected to it, brilliantly alluding to the truth of the situation, which is that all women are victims of systemic oppression in our current society. Thus, each Tradwife has been systemically conditioned to perpetuate her own oppression. Those that gain notoriety and push a narrative that they understand to be damaging and fake and horrible for their own profit or to garner individual security is doing a lot of harm. That person is now a villain, has moved from victimhood to villainhood. The conservative right's current argument is that working cat ladies are miserable and want everyone else to be miserable too. And thus they're attempting to shred apart and degrade the idea of family so that everyone else will be isolated and share in their misery. Which is just like, that's not really a motive, right? Like, this is a person that really loves literature. If this were a book, I don't think that motive would fly with the audience. I think that's pretty flimsy. And obviously, the data suggests otherwise. We do know that the happiest and most fulfilled people are women that aren't married, because women that do get married tend to take on significantly more labor than they would have otherwise. I'll let you do that research. So Burke engages with this concept early on. Natalie and Rena are going to parallel each other throughout the book, because Natalie is constantly thinking about internet stalking or comparing herself to her college roommate Rena. Often, yes, regarding herself as superior and Rena the inferior, but they're always competing in Natalie's mind. Natalie, in her first year of college, meets Caleb at a church group that she's not particularly interested in being in. Caleb is the youngest of 4 of the Mills children. His dad has run uncontested for the last 6 terms in some sort of government election, and he's run for president twice, but he's never won. There's some East Coast billionaire family. Caleb and Natalie go on 2 dates, and on one of the dates, he asks her about her dreams, and she says it's her dream to one day own her own farm. She admits to us, if you had asked any good Christian girl in Idaho at the time, they probably all would have said the same thing. The reason she said it is not because she dreamed of living on a farm, but because this is the attractive answer. We don't really learn what Natalie's real dreams might have been outside of reaching out of her community and trying to find other people that are unlikable like her. Perhaps because having dreams and visualizing a future for yourself requires understanding yourself as a person, a sort of self-actualization. And if you don't believe you'll ever be allowed to make any sort of choices, why would you spend time and energy thinking about what you want? If you've been raised to think you're an accessory and a tool that's going to be picked by someone not necessarily of your choice, you probably won't bother to dream. Anyway, Caleb really seems to take to the farm idea, and it's why, after 2 dates, he proposes to Natalie. At their engagement party, Natalie observes Caleb's mother, who throughout the entirety of the book is often drunk or high in some capacity, or recovering from forced stints in rehab. She doesn't seem to be doing well. Natalie's mother, in a silent conversation across the room, asks Natalie if this is really what she wants. She seems to be conveying that if Natalie marries Caleb, this is who she'll be, a smiling shadow standing behind the men. Her mother checks in, "I thought you wanted the world." She responds silently, basically says, "Yeah, I seen what I needed to see, and this is fine. This is what I want." On their wedding day, at the altar, Caleb dips Natalie low and says, "I can't wait to taste you." And Natalie even tells us at that moment that that was a goddamn lie. It was the performance of his life, because Natalie and Caleb's sex life it doesn't really exist. Taster he does not. They spend the next 10 years dutifully performing sex when they can in order to conceive children, because Caleb spends at least the next 10 years of their marriage unable to maintain an erection. In fact, Natalie will go so far as to have him masturbate into a cereal bowl, and then she will take his offering and impregnate herself. So we're led to believe that their first child is the only child that is conceived the normal way, I guess. How's that for immaculate conception? We're made to believe that for 5 of the 6 kids we have been introduced to, this was the case, Natalie impregnating herself. Because Natalie having lots of kids is actually one of the stipulations that her father-in-law has insisted upon if he is going to fund their little farm dream. I'll get there in a second. So Natalie is 6 months pregnant and walking across a sunny campus into her lecture hall when she comes across a hungover and downtrodden Rena. Natalie beams with pride. She's got this large rock on her finger. She seems to have the dewy glow and roundness of a pregnant lady. She seems to be wearing it well. She has this bright future of wealth and status in front of her, despite the fact that she's only 19 years old and hasn't had to work for any of it the way that Rena is now working for everything that she wants. She's gonna have to put in late hours, whatever. Natalie takes great delight in imagining Rena's future sufferings at work. And yet, it's 3 months later, during her labor, that Natalie reveals to us that every single woman she knows has lied to her about birth and about motherhood. I have to breathe through this. because I think it's scary. Natalie, whom is basically a girl herself at the age of 19, is a new mom to baby Clementine. She immediately resents and starts competing with the baby girl. Initially, Natalie struggles with postpartum, though it is never labeled that. Though it is only labeled postpartum after her 4th child, when she's telling us she didn't experience it because she immediately got pregnant right away. She initially has some dissociative qualities wherein she doesn't recognize baby Clementine as her own. Natalie is leveled by the reality she's been sneering at her collegiate peers for acknowledging. She tells us that she's not yet ready to vanish into the title of mama. Natalie's mother, in an effort to help, day after she gives birth, suggests that maybe she go for a run around the emergency room to get those endorphins up. Because what's important to remember about the creed of the Tradwife is that not only are your emotions your responsibility, all of our emotions are our responsibility, but it's your responsibility to perform happiness for your husband and also for this child that you've just brought into the world. There are a lot of reasons that that is a problem and dangerous. The nurse overhears this conversation and is like, you are absolutely not going for a run. What the your body just split in half. What? But when the nurses change shifts, Natalie sneaks out, goes for a run anyway, and really does rip her stitches open. One of the themes of this book, but also a theme of conservative Christian culture, is the idea that women are supposed to be suffering and the belief in punitive behaviors. So when something doesn't go the way you wanted it to, or something's different than how you expected it to, or you behave in a way that's disappointing to yourself, self-flagellation is necessary in order to repent. It's not just confession, it's suffering and pain, right? We are all born guilty. Christ paid for our sins. I don't know. I'm not super familiar with the Later, Caleb and Natalie move into her mother's house with their new baby. And Natalie, because she's a woman of privilege, doesn't tend to her baby for the first 2 weeks that it's alive. In fact, she spends most of that time hiding under the covers, terrified, ultimately avoiding what she's done. And again, she's been conditioned since the start of her life to believe that this was her purpose. It makes sense that she did it, particularly because, again, she's 19 years old. While she's in the depths of postpartum and receiving no help for herself, but her mom is caring for baby Clementine, which is, again, a privilege not afforded to every woman. If you don't have non-working family in the area, this is not something that Natalie could have taken the time to do. But at one of the times when she's laying in bed, she's greeted by her sister Abigail. I'm not going to get too deep into Abigail's story, but Abigail married her high school sweetheart, who Natalie understood to be a loser. Those are the words that she chose. He's apparently not very attractive or wealthy or whatever. He doesn't have any of the attributes that Natalie considers important, and despite the fact that she's a few years older, she didn't go to college, and she actually has several children now. Abigail attempts to confide in Natalie and engage with their sisterly bond by admitting vulnerably how awful this new reality is. Natalie shuts her sister down immediately. Apparently, they've never been the type to talk to one another or confide secrets and feelings in one another, so she pushes her sister away and basically says, no, you feel that way, not me. Though it's clear, right, how Natalie is feeling. After Abigail has been dismissed, Caleb, Natalie's new husband, brings her a present. It's a pair of running shoes, and they are baby blue. Natalie says she can feel her mother puppeteering her new husband. Caleb gives her a pair of running shoes and a baby carrier vest and is like, great, now you can run with the baby. And Natalie, when her husband is suggesting that she take their 2-week-old baby on a jog, fully comes to grips with the fact that her husband is an idiot. And she starts to recognize that she has no idea who she married. Natalie does eventually take those shoes and go on a walk, and she walks through all the neighborhoods, and she sees a lot of happy wives in the window and men coming home from work, and she decides that what her problem is that Caleb doesn't have a job. So through coercion, manipulation, and just general pushing, she tries to force Caleb to get a job. He's not really interested in working though. He never has, and spoiler alert, he never will. He will never work. While Natalie's walking around the neighborhood, she also comes to understand that it's not that everyone else is happy and she's not, it's that everyone else is willing to perform happiness, and thus that's what she will do. So it is very much much acknowledged at like the top 15% of the book that none of this is real. And yet she's built such a competition around classmates that aren't thinking about her, don't care about her, don't know her at all. The world that she has grown up in is so focused on maintaining the image or the perception of what her life must be like that she'd rather perpetuate, that she'd rather not be proven wrong than be happy or free. And that doesn't make any sense. It's not particularly logical. So Natalie confides in her mother after months of Caleb refusing to become employed, and her mother encourages her to do what any good Christian woman would do, call his mother. And so Natalie calls his mother and cries on the phone to her about what a shame it is and how humiliating it is to have this husband that doesn't believe in working and this family that's not going to go anywhere without their husband at the helm. Because one of the things that the book explores is the inherent contradiction in the roles that have been prescribed here. Natalie is an effective head of household, and it's one of the things that brings both her and Caleb a significant amount of shame because she's been born in the wrong body. So Caleb's parents insist that they fly out to California and live in their big home until they can whip Caleb into shape. When they arrive there, Caleb is grumpy and insolent, much like a toddler, and he asks for a glass of milk. Natalie meets the eyes of her father-in-law, Doug, and they both wonder why the fuck she married this guy. She says, at this most important moment in my life, I'd made a critical error of judgment. I'd mistaken a man's wealth for his intellect. Worse, there was absolutely nothing to be done about it. And this is where we know that's not true. It didn't have to be that way, right? It's only that way if you believe that you are not allowed to leave, that you're beholden to the decisions that 18-year-old you made. So anyway, Natalie's disgusted by her husband's lack of ambition, and Caleb feels really betrayed that Natalie has evoked the mother clause and told his mom that he's basically misbehaving. So now mom's supposed to do something about it. We hang with Natalie while she lives in this California house waiting for his parents to raise their adult son, and his parents are waiting for her to whip their adult son into shape. So nothing much happens in California except for two things. One of them is that Caleb decides that he would like to be a kindergarten teacher. He really wants to hang out with kids all day and help them learn the fundamentals of being a human being. He just really likes to hang around and hang with kids. And Natalie is so revolted by that idea because kindergarten teachers are supposed to be women. She sends him to look at what curriculums teach. She's like, do you really want to be a pawn for the liberal agenda and hurt children in this way? She understands that what she's saying is not real. And thus he enters the top of a very deep rabbit hole that he'll spend the rest of his life down. He is convinced by conspiracy theorists and radical right-wing misogynists that current education curriculums are in fact dangerous for young children because they're teaching white guilt and trans ideology, whatever. She manipulated her husband instead of being able to confront him and tell him he's wrong about something because that's not in her wifely purview. She had to manipulate him to move him into a space where other men would tell him that that's not a good idea. Also, something that happens is that Natalie decides that, hey, they could move to Idaho, they could build a farm, and she could ultimately hide her incompetent husband there while making it look like they're living this grand American dream. So from the top, Natalie has never bought into the rhetoric that she espouses, nor does she believe it's going to make her happy and healthy. She goes to Doug about this. Doug, the politician and the billionaire, is also embarrassed of his youngest son. So Natalie goes to Doug and sort of threatens, sort of begs him to give them $5 million for 3 years to own, operate, and start to run a ranch farm in Idaho. And he consents immediately. He's like, okay. And Natalie's like, shit, I should ask for more money. It's during this conversation that Doug stipulates that if they want the money, they're going to have more children. And that's a real problem because Caleb hasn't wanted or been willing or been able to have sex with Natalie since they conceived Clementine. In fact, at one point in time, Natalie happened upon her husband's computer and found some porn. And then she immediately labels him a sex pervert. But I encourage you to look at what the porn is, which is like, ultimately, it's like the most ridiculous, it's loving relationship, it's passion, whatever. I'm not gonna explain it to you. You read the book. Meanwhile, when she's having this conversation, she's recognizing that Doug is a real man, not someone who asks for power, but who takes it. And she, in fact, fantasizes about him making a sort of quid pro quo offering where wherein she is forced to have sex with him in exchange for the money, but he doesn't do that. So they move to this farm, they restore the farm, and they have to find a way to make money because after 3 years, the 5 million will run out, and they're spending it quite cavalierly. Caleb, on a whim, often buys horses and cows. In the forums where he tries to understand dairy farming with the more serious farmers, he is warned that he is extremely ill-prepared and should not engage in this endeavor without further education. He then finds other forums that encourage him to go ahead and buy a cow, whatever. If he has the cash, he'll figure it out along the way. Those are the forums he prefers to hang out in. The animals that they buy tend to die shortly after their arrival because these are 2 children that have no idea how to take care of animals. Something else that takes place is that Natalie's father-in-law, Doug, decides to go for his real presidential bid. It's not something that Caleb's mother is excited about because it means she has to change her entire life. She's described binge eating and engaging with substances in a really compulsive and addictive manner, and is eventually, like I said, sequestered off to rehab where she's supposed to sober up. Anytime we see her after that, she is even more a shadow of herself, is quite gaunt, is very hollow, and says nothing. After she's sent to rehab, she has 2 lines, and they're terrifying, and I'll tell them to you later. In fact, at one point in time, during Doug's presidential bid, Natalie comes in to find Amelia, Caleb's mother, passed out on the floor, having vomited up the pudding that she had eaten. And before Caleb's brothers will let the paramedics in to help her, they make all the paramedics sign NDAs. So Yesteryear does a really cool job. The book never has to explicitly acknowledge the through line of corruption in every aspect of this lifestyle for you to understand that it's not real. It's fucking everywhere. Okay, now, one morning, Natalie, without explanation, wakes up in a bed that is not her home, in a house that is much like hers, but isn't hers. And she is told by children that are hers but aren't hers that she's in the year 1855. All these children regard her as mama. She immediately tries to escape, assuming she's been kidnapped by a fan or has been put on some sort of reality TV show. She runs for the hills and is met by who she calls Old Caleb, someone who looks like her husband but isn't really her husband. And he immediately hits her. He says he doesn't like to hit her, but he has to. It's his husbandly duty to get her in line. We don't all want to be disciplined, but we're much better off for it. So he hits her in the face and she passes out and she wakes up again in this house. She runs for it one more time, running straight through the woods in winter without shoes on, and she runs into a bear trap, and her 13-year-old daughter, Mary, has to stitch up her foot. When she wakes up in this world, 1855, she is no longer 6 months pregnant. And it's something she feels pretty terrified about. The eldest of the 4 children that she is now taking care of in this multiverse reality, we as the reader, it's so good because we're like, where is this going to be time travel? Are we really going to have our protagonist time travel in a book that's otherwise been based in reality? Her oldest, 13-year-old Mary, has ultimately been acting as a mother for her 3 younger siblings, doing all of the cooking, cleaning, medical care, educating, doing everything. She's doing all the work all the time. Natalie resents these children, often screaming at them that they are not her children. She's very confused and very scared, as anyone would be when waking up inside of a life that they did not choose. The kids and Mary regard Natalie in 1855 as someone who's relatively useless. She tries to make bread and it always tastes really bad because she didn't actually used to home make the bread. And ultimately she's just tasked with doing laundry and freezing water, and it just takes hours and hours, and it's a never-ending task, and it's extremely monotonous, and it's something that makes her want to die. After several weeks of sleeping alone in her bed due to her hysteria and then her injury with her foot, Caleb warns her that he will be coming to her bed tonight and that it is her wifely duty to submit to him in bed. And this is when Natalie loses all hope that she's on some sort of reality TV show, because yes, America hates women and would be totally fine with them getting hit on TV, but they're not going to broadcast a woman being raped on TV. Old Caleb comes in and has sex with Natalie without her consent, and it's the first time that she ever orgasms. So, because it's the first time she's had sex with Caleb where he has an erection. So let's talk about the murky consent waters for a second. It wasn't until the 70s that laws were passed protecting women inside of marriages. Marital rape didn't exist, meaning the concept of your consent. It wasn't something you could give to your husband because consent is born out of your own agency to decide what happens to you and what doesn't happen to you. So can you give consent in a world, in a society, in a system, in a church that believes that you aren't a person? Natalie decides to start documenting their Tradwife lifestyle and even takes an online course to learn how to be more likable and how marketable and how to make money doing this. Her husband, Caleb, puts a link to her work in the Mano-sphere forum, and someone in that forum who happens to have an enormous platform does a piece on her, describing her as the correct way to be a woman. Look how beautiful and exhausted she is. That podcaster says that she hand makes her own bread, that this family is entirely self-sufficient, and that this is the way good homegrown American kids are raised. And Natalie starts to panic because she doesn't make her own bread. In fact, the bread featured in her video that he's showing at that moment is store-bought. They can't farm any vegetables and they refuse to farm any meat, and all of their animals keep dying because Caleb doesn't know how to run a farm because it requires a lot of precision and expertise, is my understanding. They end up hiring ranch hands. Caleb goes out and he starts selling the vegetables that they are able to grow as organic, but it's illegal because they do use pesticides in order to get those vegetables to grow. So it's just demonstrated over and over and over again. Nothing that's being broadcasted about their reality is real, particularly when it comes to the relationship with the children. Because as soon as Natalie is able to hire those nannies, she's never alone with her children again. Initially, Caleb pushes back against the idea of nannies. He says the kids don't need a nanny, they need a mother. She agrees with that, but she doesn't want to be a mother. She doesn't like what is required of mothering, and she doesn't seem to know or like her children very much. It's really sad. It's that podcaster who lies about what Natalie's Instagram actually is that launches her into Tradwife stardom. All of a sudden, she goes from having 3,000 followers and 4 children to 10,000 followers, 20,000 followers, and eventually up into the millions. And the whole thing kind of happens in a whirlwind. Natalie has to learn how to become good at content creation, which is in itself an art with an enormous audience. She takes all of the feedback that she gets, the critical comments online and the positive comments, and uses that feedback to hone her lifestyle. At one point in time, when the farm is running suitably well, Natalie's mom and sister and her sister's 5 kids come to visit. Natalie is horribly ashamed that her sister has lapped her as it relates to production of children. She also, in her very little sister-esque way, spends a lot of time commenting on Abigail's appearance. Abigail has started smoking. Natalie thinks she's really aged. Having 5 kids will, I guess, do that to you. And when the 3 women are alone for the first time, Abigail confides that she's going to leave her husband. She's going to get a divorce. Her mom starts freaking out, crying, and what has she done wrong? Maybe she raised them in a way that made them so broken. And Natalie takes pretty extreme offense to this. She also tries to reality check her sister in a way that doesn't necessarily feel like it's done out of love. She says, what are you going to do? Where are you going to go? So you're going to get a divorce and you're going to be a single mother of 5 and you don't have any degree or work experience. So what are you going to do? Bag groceries with the teenagers? Abigail starts crying. You can't live at mom's house forever. You have 5 kids. She starts bullying her sister back into the submission that she's finally admitted she's ready to break free from. When Abigail and her 5 kids are on their way out the door, Clementine says she wishes she could go with them. This conversation with Abigail prompts Natalie to consider her own future. She knows that she signed a prenup before she married Caleb. She won't have access to any money, won't be able to feed, house, or clothe her children in the way that they are accustomed to without Caleb. Also, this big farmhouse that she's done all the work for, that she found, planned, attained the funds for, it's entirely in Caleb's name. If Caleb is to leave Natalie, Natalie will be left with nothing. Natalie even knows that it's important to keep this information from her less than aware husband because even the sweetest, stupidest man man can grow cruel and cunning when he learns a thing like that Natalie is entirely helpless. She is completely dependent, reliant, and submissive to him. She knows that him having that information can change his behavior, and there's nothing she can do about it. Which, to be clear, is the entire Tradwife lifestyle ideology that you just have to trust. Natalie, 5 children and a few years into the Idaho farmhouse saga, thinks back to when her mother was sitting on her hospital bed. Her mother had said to her when she was in the depths of postpartum that you'll feel like yourself again soon. And Natalie says she was young enough to believe her. You never age out of it. Your mother lies to you, and then you lie to your children, and then your children lie to their children, and then you are an old woman looking back at your own life, lying to yourself. If no one had lied to her about motherhood, she might never have done it. And I think that's the point. So she starts wiring some of the enormous sums of money she's receiving from Instagram into her own bank account, just in case. Because if Caleb were to ever leave her, she'd have nothing, no degree, and also no brand. This money, the Instagram money and the influencer money, merely supplements the allowance they still receive from Caleb's dad. So not only is the motherhood aspect not real, not only is the farming ranch aspect not real, the pull yourself up by your bootstraps concept isn't real either, because they aren't able to do any of this without parental assistance because they're children. So Caleb actually finds out that she's funneling some of the money into an independent account, and he comes in and he passive-aggressively threatens her. And this is the only moment that's going to lend some credence to accusations later on. But Natalie then, in the middle of the night, has to call Instagram and get the money split earlier in the process so the bank doesn't rat her out to her husband. Natalie spends a lot of time thinking about the angry women on the internet. It's actually Caleb that comes up with that term. Sometimes she meets fans in real life and then behaves incorrectly. She fears and works tirelessly to avoid turning a fan into an angry woman by doing something wrong, by not being kind enough, by not being likable enough, whatever it is. Because everything about the Natalie online persona isn't real. Because if we really dive into the psyche of Natalie, she doesn't entirely exist. She only exists to accept feedback and then adapt accordingly. She's just trying to survive. She also happens to be really mean. The book nods at the children of this story, the parentified and the exploited. It does pose questions as to whether or not these children should have some say as it relates again to consent and their faces being put online. More than that, their likeness being something their parents profit off of. They are used as props in this sales pitch. The book explores the depth of inconsideration involved in neglect and how reckless and damaging neglect really is. It explores this through the animals, yes. The mills go through 4 dairy cows in 2 years. All the dairy cows die of inexplicable causes. And they never specifically say, but we find out this 4 cows in 2 years figure at the end of the book. But Natalie at the beginning of the book explains that the cows keep dying every 6 months. So I think we're meant to understand that the entire time they've owned this farm, they've lost 2 cows a year. All the cows are named sassafras. So the audience never notices when a cow has been replaced. At one point in time, there's a fox that gets into the chicken coop and slaughters all of the chickens. Our protagonist doesn't display or seem to experience any anguish or culpability for caging and taking responsibility for a helpless animal and then ineffectively caring for it and failing to keep it safe. The same is true with the many children that this Mills family is going to produce. We also learned that these children aren't attaining any legitimate education, and Clementine, at the age of 11, doesn't know what an ocean is. So they're not just being neglected as it relates to food, nourishment, affection, and care. They're on the internet and they're forced to work and sell things that they don't want to and don't believe in, but they also aren't receiving any resources as it relates to their development. That's neglect. They often are also yelled at, perhaps called names, by Natalie. She certainly calls them names in her head, and we're meant to believe that not everything that she thinks is in her head is in her head, so it's very possible she's calling all of her children really horrible names. Animal abuse parallels to the neglect of the children and the child abuse that they experience. Clementine, the eldest daughter, is routinely employed to watch or teach or groom her many younger siblings, We witness her protests to being on camera and to taking care of her family, and the protests go unheard. The Tradwife influence is called influence for a reason. It's having an impact. Natalie herself can't grasp this. She refuses to actively endorse Doug's campaign, but she is willing to bring her family to his political events, thereby subtly endorsing him. In his presidential bid, his main campaign is espousing the bullshit that Caleb has come to believe. Conspiracy theories fed to him by his degenerate son. At one point in time, Natalie is confronted by Shannon, her 21-year-old producer, about how terrifying Doug's campaign speech was. Doug tells us that it doesn't really matter who heads the campaign. It's all gonna happen one way or another. Natalie squints and shakes her head, dismisses Shannon's fears, says, "You don't have to worry about that. None of that's real. The poisonous rats in New York aren't really a big deal." We're about 50% through the book when our narrator starts to question her comprehension of reality, and we don't really believe her when she's questioning it. I don't know. I didn't necessarily question her account of things, even when she tells us that she may be at a space where she no longer decides what she says out loud and what she thinks. She can't distinguish. It is confirmed for us at the 85% mark because Natalie comes to understand that she often says things out loud that she didn't realize she was saying out loud. This is a horror story because of the real-life ambiguity and implications of the subjugation these women are preaching for and perhaps experiencing. So I've explained that on top of having the two nannies, Natalie has also hired this producer, Shannon. She hired Shannon when she was 19 years old. Shannon had dropped out of college and became an immediate asset to the Heller Mills Farm team, to the Yesteryear team. It is revealed to us very early on in the book that Caleb and Shannon are having an affair. Caleb is 34 years old and Shannon is now 21 years old. Caleb confesses to Natalie that he's in love with Shannon. This all comes to light actually after Doug's big campaign because Shannon confronts Caleb about his harmful, derogatory, and conspiratorial beliefs. In fact, she manages to convince him and decondition him of this idea about the rats. I'm not going to explain it to you. Caleb comes to Natalie and is like, "Did you know the rat thing wasn't real?" And Natalie's like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Well, Shannon says you think I'm an idiot, and I'm not as much of an idiot as you think I am. And I'm actually really smart. And me and Shannon, we're moving to New York, and we're going to live our life there." So Caleb, the 34-year-old, is going to move to New York with Shannon, the 21-year-old, and leave his 5, soon-to-be 6 kids unattended. And he's fully aware of the implications of his prenup. This guy sucks. He has no redeemable qualities. We know that Caleb is 34 and sleeping with the 21-year-old producer that he employs. There's a power dynamic. Again, questioning the very murky waters of consent. Natalie, recognizing the precariousness of her situation, immediately calls Doug. Tells Doug, who has used Natalie and Caleb and their, uber successful and influential content to bolster his own campaign. She calls Doug and tells him that his degenerate son is again about to do something that could impact all of their lives. So Doug calls Caleb and tells him that he should run for office. Caleb immediately abandons the plan to run away with this 21-year-old and is said like, "Oh my God, my dad believes in me. I'm gonna run for office." It's so embarrassing. This man has never held a job. Caleb drops the 21-year-old he was gonna leave his entire family for in under 24 hours. Natalie, feeling like her entire house is turning against her and certain alliances have formed with her included in none of them. So Natalie goes to confront Shannon, who at the time happens to not be wearing any pants. She's pulling on her pants and telling Natalie that her husband is actually a lot smarter than Natalie thinks he is, which is just like, imagine spending 15 years with a man and having some other younger woman tell you that he's actually so smart. Shannon insists that Caleb's actually responsible for this whole operation. He masterminded this whole thing. He got you to do all of this work. The implication is either that Caleb has lied about the amount of work he's put into this farm, he's confused about the amount of work he's put into this farm, or we're meant to believe that he really did mastermind this whole situation, building a world wherein he gets to just be in online chat rooms and watch football all day. You tell me. You read the book. You tell me if Caleb's a mastermind. I don't think so. I think think Caleb is the youngest son to a rich daddy, and I don't think he's really ever formulated a thought or had to worry about his safety because he's always been secure and safe, and he always will be. I think the truth about Caleb is the truth about most humans, and it's that you're going to try exactly as hard as you have to. And Caleb, born the youngest to a billionaire, seems to have been handed literally everything and thus is incapable of working for literally anything. He has not developed the skills necessary to be a productive member of society. He is literally unpracticed and thus inept at working. Unless you buy that Caleb was this mastermind that manipulated his wife into building this thing, I think Caleb would have been content to sit on her mom's couch. I don't think Caleb wanted to do anything other than watch football. So, when Shannon reveals that her and Caleb have had a sexual relationship, Natalie's like, okay, well, it can't have been awesome because of the factor, because of X, Y, and Z. And Shannon says, oh my God, Natalie. And that's what makes Natalie snap. She sort of comes to with her hands around Natalie's neck, straddling her on the bed in the nanny producer room that they live in. Natalie lets go, but she has assaulted, ultimately, this younger woman, and she only had her pants partway pulled up, and she obviously choked her. Natalie calls Doug to tell him that they have a potential PR nightmare on their hands because their producer has just resigned and was sleeping with her husband, and he assembles the troops. They have this whole PR firm come in, they have a whole team of lawyers, and they're prepared to see what Shannon's gonna do. When Shannon goes on TV and not only has video footage of Natalie yelling at her children, of the children looking miserable, behind the scenes footage of pesticides and extra help and so on and so forth, Doug and his team start to panic. But it's when Shannon reveals that Natalie hurt her, that Natalie choked her, and that there was perhaps a sexual undertone to that altercation, that the entire family turns on Natalie. In fact, this is a direct quote. It would be so much easier if they had an inappropriate and non-consensual sexual relationship than for Natalie to be an aggressive woman. Because we learn, they say many things, like America is very understanding of politicians and parents who have disappointing kids. America is very understanding of men who are accused of rape. What America's not understanding of is women who aren't being who they're supposed to be. Women who act outside of the kindness and gentile that they're constantly supposed to be displaying. Women that prove to us that they are people, capable of anger, aggression, and even violence. So, Natalie, in this behind-the-scenes footage, is immediately ripped apart by the masses. She loses her entire brand because everyone has to reckon with the fact she deceived us, she tricked us, which it chafes against our socially acceptable idea of what a woman is, passive and perpetually believing the best in people. We are always shocked and fascinated by women who are revealed to be violent, especially when they've been performing motherhood and femininity so effectively. Whereas when men reveal themselves to be violent, we're like, yeah, okay, well, were the signs maybe there? We've come to forgive and perhaps expect this behavior in men. We certainly tolerate it or find reasons to excuse it. While everything's falling apart, Natalie sees a video of Clementine on TV and she recognizes just how young she is. Because another piece of this book, another thing that this book manages to highlight so well, is the intrinsic competition between mothers and daughters under this patriarchal doctrine. The entire time, Natalie is recognizing Clementine as someone who's growing up and going to be a threat and is her clone, ultimately looping in the concept of ageism. Every day, Natalie gets older and teaches Clementine how to be the better version of her, thus replacing herself. If mothers and daughters are allowed to be individuals with their own wants and needs, they would have nothing to compete for. While all of this climax is taking place and Natalie's entire brand is falling apart, we flash back to 1855. Maeve, the youngest child, who we don't get an age for until the very end of the book, is very, very, very sick. And Maeve is actually the only child that we see Natalie harbor any sort of tenderness for or tolerate any affection from. Maeve is really sick, and Mary, in her desperation, sends her mother, who typically is a flight risk, out to look for a doctor because they believe Maeve is in imminent danger and old Caleb is not that worried about it. So Natalie takes to the woods, fully believing that she's going to send a doctor back, but ultimately attempting to flee the situation. situation that she has been trapped in for several months in the dead of winter. She comes upon a shed with the word Mano-sphere on the top and a truck outside of it. And what she sees is a young man taking stickers off of grocery store bought carrots and making them dirty and putting them into crates. She also sees a television and other modern technology. So that's a really reality shattering moment for us, the reader, because as Natalie grapples with what could possibly have gone on, as she trifles through the options, she's been kidnapped by a fan, she's been put on some sort of reality show, she's being punished, placed in some sort of purgatory with children that are sort of hers and sort of not hers. It's God's way of testing her after her failings, punishing her after her failings. Her coming across a truck and a shed with modern technology and amenities in it reveals to us that one, she's not in some sort of purgatory, and two, she's certainly not in 1855. She hasn't time traveled. We come to find that this Mano-sphere shed is the place that the 13-year-old boys in the family get to access once they become a man, and that the younger kids and the women don't get any part of this because this is a man shed. Natalie returns to her house in 1855 in sort of a daze. The next day, she hears a truck rumble up the drive, and who steps out of the car but Clementine, now older and in modern clothing. She has a conversation with her mother wherein she asks why she's continuing to live like this. It becomes clear to us as the reader that Natalie is not at all a reliable narrator, and in fact has been experiencing breaks in reality for many, many years, at least since Clementine was 16. We learn that after the brand fell apart, in an effort to avoid jail time, they decided to actually live out the pioneer life that they'd been pretending to live out. They go to the bathroom exclusively in an outhouse, and Natalie has given birth 3 times in this pioneer style, with no doctor, no midwife, no drugs. In fact, her last birth, her most recent birth, the birth of Maeve, who's actually 10 years old, but when we're reading the book, seems to be developmentally 4 or 5. We learned that Maeve developed intellectual disability because of the neglect that Caleb and Natalie practiced when she was giving birth. Was in fact the child Mary, who thought to give CPR. She wouldn't have known what that was at the time because Mary has received 0 education and is the reason that Maeve survived. So Clementine has arrived with an order from social services and packs all of their kids into the car. Caleb and Natalie look at one another, and Natalie begins to remember why she's doing this, who she is, and what she's subjecting herself to. It's another really gorgeously written way and really sickening illustration of the punitive behaviors that religion encourages, but that women are expected to subject themselves to. We learn that when old Caleb in 1855 was working on the farm every day, what he was actually doing was watching football in his Mano-sphere cave. His child daughter was doing all the work to keep this family afloat, and that every single time he comes in the house, the first thing he says is, "What's for dinner?" And he looks at Mary. Oh, when we thought he was out there doing ranch hand work, like that was one thing, but like, oh God, their other children were purchasing the resources that the family would need in the form of food, vegetables, flowers, and whatnot. This family definitely has gone without. These children have been deprived, but the only reason they've had any resources whatsoever are their other kids. The reason that Natalie looks at these children and thinks they're hers, but they're not hers, is because she doesn't remember giving birth to them, but she did. The Mills go through 4 dairy cows in 2 years. Me and Shannon, we're moving to New York. Natalie has 9 children by the end of this book, and she hasn't properly cared for any of them. She in fact admits to us that she was more removed from each child. In fact, in 1855, she can't remember the faces of her younger children. When she's still in present day, she walks into the nanny's room and isn't able to identify one of her younger children because she spent that little time with her. The whole thing is calling attention to not just the fallacy in the lifestyle doctrine that's being espoused, but the pain and suffering that comes with subjugation that is being romanticized. It doesn't mean that your kids live a better life. Natalie sacrificing whatever dreams she may have had to live out this life does not mean that her children were better off. In fact, they were worse off. Because what children need are self-actualized parents who believe in personal accountability and responsibility and consequences and learning and love. So far be it for us to be tricked into believing our main character was sane, right? Like when it is revealed that, no, yeah, yeah, she's just had a break in consciousness and doesn't remember her life here, and thus feels incredibly trapped inside of it and is literally being held hostage by her husband and her children, even though it's a hostage situation of her choosing, is an enormously brilliant writing tactic, right? Of course she was never sane. Look at her choices. Her choices are inherently the antithesis to everything she says she wants and everything that's in her best interest. Of course she's crazy. I also think that Natalie giving birth in the pioneer age 3 times is the most obvious form of this punitive behavior. It is so terrifying. It's the deepest self-flagellation and also links up to the biblical suffering that women are supposed to suffer because of Eve's rotten apple. And let us not forget that it is the eldest daughters that save us all. Clementine, at 16 years old, sacrifices her life and kidnaps her siblings when it becomes clear that her parents are about to remove themselves from society. She sacrifices her adolescence to live with her maternal grandmother and keep her siblings safe. It is also Clementine who sacrifices her young adulthood, working with social workers and law enforcement until she can build a compelling enough case to remove the other children that her parents have had from that home so that she can take them and raise them somewhere safe. She takes them to California. It's Mary, the other eldest daughter in this family, who's kept them afloat, feeding, nurturing, clothing, and bathing her 3 younger siblings and her parents. All this to say, you should read Yesteryear. It's a great book. We get an epilogue from the point of view of Natalie, who is now serving a 34-year prison sentence for child and animal abuse. We don't hear what happens to Caleb. I don't know if he's also in prison, but we do know that society tends to prefer to imprison women for daring to believe they could do the wrong things that men do. And the book ends with Natalie being interviewed by Rena, the only person she was willing to sit down in an interview for. Rena has become a local news anchor, definitely not a household name, but in that interview, Rena hands Natalie her daughter's book, Mary's book, called The Book of Mary. Mary, in her epilogue, forgives her parents and notes that she does still miss them. We learn that when Mary was 10, Caleb told her that she needed to become a mother for her own mom. We learn about her struggle to assimilate to modern-day society. We learn that she is now bagging groceries, the same fate that Natalie sneered at for her sister Abigail. It's revealed that they live with Clementine in California and that Clementine still can't see the Pacific without crying. This is a message from Mary to her mom. She says, "Hello, Mama. I miss you. Isn't that funny? Even after everything, I still miss you. I miss your temper and your jokes and your strange little moods." She says, "Mom, how much beauty you've missed, because it really is beautiful. This future you prayed we would never get the chance to see. You cannot change people who refuse to be changed. You can only love them." Mary, in her book, depicts learning how to read and write, something she couldn't do when she was removed from her parents' home, but something that she now can. The book is really so good and dives into so many important concepts surrounding motherhood and childbirth and childhood and relationship to family and family's relationship to church and church's relationship to society and government. And I can't recommend it enough. This is one of those books that I don't think we'll forget, that is meant to reflect not only the more dystopian direction that our society seems to be barreling toward, and also the horrors that currently exist. The horrors that we've come to normalize, the horrors that we've been desensitized to, come to regard as normal, depicted for us on the page and made us feel sick once again. Caro Claire Burke, hats off to you. You are a phenomenal writer, and I can't wait to dive into your future work. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Sage. I hope to see you next time.